letter gone before dawn's first light. Welcome to my night detective. I am your host, Elderwick. Share in the comments. Where are you listening from today? Your voices make this mystery unforgettable. Let's begin. The morning was still too early, too quiet, even for Oxford. I stepped into the narrow street, the cobblestones slick with the remnants of a night's rain, their dark sheen reflecting the pale, reluctant light of a grey November sky. The city, at this hour, seemed almost unreal, as though it existed only in the quiet space between sleep and waking. In the distance, the bells of Magdalen tolled faintly, a reminder that time, like the mist that hung in the air, would not be held at bay for long. I walked, not because I had any particular destination in mind, but because there was something comforting in the rhythm of my footsteps, the steady echo against the stone. Oxford had always been a place for those like me, those who preferred the solitude of thought to the company of people, those who walked the streets with a certain knowing, as if the city had already claimed them. The libraries, the spires, the quiet courtyards, every corner held a secret, every book an untold story. I passed through the front gates of Magdalen College, the ancient stone walls still damp from the rain, and wondered, as I always did, how many had walked these paths before me. The same question had haunted me in my years here as a student, and it still haunted me now, as an investigator. What was it that people left behind? What did they take with them, and what did they try, futilely, to bury in the shadows? I found my way to the King's Arms, where I often went when the need for reflection overtook me. The pub was nearly empty, save for a few patrons whose heads were bent over the morning paper or lost in private thoughts. I ordered a glass of whiskey, though it was early, and took a seat by the window. The glass, cold to the touch, was a small comfort. The faint glow of the lamp cast long shadows across the polished wood of the table, and outside, the mist seemed to gather in the corners of the world, obscuring everything but what was right in front of me. I leaned back, my mind drifting toward the crossword I had started earlier. It was a habit of mine, the crossword, a small act of discipline, a way to focus my mind when it threatened to wander too far. The clue had been simple enough. A body of water, frozen in time. It took me longer than it should have to see the answer, but when it came, it was as if the word had always been there, waiting. Lake. How simple. How fitting. It was the kind of answer that, once uncovered, made everything else seem more obvious. Yet the simplicity of it didn't prevent the nagging feeling that there was something more, something in the space between the words, between the lines, that still eluded me. I set the crossword aside and sipped my whiskey, letting the warmth spread slowly through my chest. The case I had been called to, another quiet death in the midst of Oxford's academic world, was weighing on me. I'd yet to meet the victim, nor had I spoken to anyone who could truly explain what had happened. But I could feel the emptiness surrounding it, a kind of absence that seemed to hang in the air, just out of reach. A letter had disappeared before anyone could read it. A subtle clue, perhaps, but one that seemed to mean more than it should. I sighed, turning the glass in my hand, and glanced at the corner of the pub where the fire flickered quietly in its grate. The flames, like the case itself, seemed to burn with a slow, quiet intensity. But what I had yet to understand was what would remain when the fire had burned itself out. What exactly was being consumed? A noise from the other side of the room, a book dropping from a table, the faint sound of a chair scraping against the floor, disturbed my thoughts. I looked up and saw a figure in the doorway, tall, hunched slightly, wearing the gray of a college professor. He didn't notice me immediately, but I recognized him at once. Dr. Trent, a figure whose presence seemed to haunt the academic corridors of Oxford as much as any ghost. I had not spoken with her in years, but I could feel the weight of the history between us, a history that had never quite found its resolution. She moved toward the bar, her eyes cast downward, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of a notebook clutched in her hand. It was the same notebook I had seen the victim holding the last time I had seen him, the same one that now, mysteriously, appeared to be missing. I stood up slowly, aware of the quiet tension in the air, the slow shift of the world that seemed to be drawing us together, if only for a moment. She had not seen me yet, but I knew I would speak with her soon. There were too many things left unsaid between us, too many unanswered questions. The crossword, the empty glass, the figure of Doctor Trent, all of them seemed to be leading somewhere, though I could not say where. As I walked toward her, the mist outside seemed to press in against the window, as if trying to follow me into the quiet, empty space that had begun to fill my thoughts. There were answers waiting, I knew. But for now, all I could do was follow the quiet footsteps of Oxford and wait for the case to unfold in its own time. It was a curious thing, how death can slip into the very fabric of a place and remain unnoticed, silent, unremarked upon, until the smallest detail calls it to the surface. The strange death at Saint. Abridged was no different. By the time I received the call, the campus had returned to its usual rhythm, the soft hum of academic life pressing on, unaware of the loss that had already taken place. I stepped into the college late in the afternoon, the low sun casting long shadows over the stone buildings, the familiar scent of damp earth and old books hanging in the air like some half-forgotten memory. Saint. Abridged was one of those colleges with a quiet reputation. Not as grand as Magdalene, not as storied as Balliol, but old enough to be heavy with history, heavy with expectation. I had never been here before, but I had walked the streets surrounding it enough times to recognize the weight of its silence. The very walls seemed to carry a quiet weight, as if everything within them had been carefully curated, sorted, and set in place by hands long gone. The perfect place for something to be hidden. When I arrived at the guest house, I was met by the college porter, who led me inside with a hesitant grace, like a man too accustomed to standing at the edges of other people's troubles. He spoke little, offering only the occasional glance at the closed door to the victim's study, as though the very act of crossing its threshold was something best left to others. I could understand why. It was clear from the start that the death, though officially ruled an accident, felt off, wrong in a way that I couldn't quite name. The victim was a young professor, Thomas Webb, 35 at most, who had been at St. Abridged for a few years, quietly making a name for himself in the field of medieval studies. Quietly, always quietly. His colleagues, as I would soon find out, had little to say about him. He was a man of few friends, of even fewer confidants. Some described him as reserved, others as distant. A man so immersed in his own work that the rest of the world scarcely seemed to touch him. It was easy to imagine a life like that, one spent between the pages of dusty tomes, where the voices of others could fade into the background, only to be replaced by the soft murmur of your own thoughts. Webb's study was immaculate, the shelves stacked with neatly arranged books, papers, and manuscripts. It was the kind of space you could imagine someone spending hours in, and yet something was missing. The clutter of life, the small signs that a man had lived there, not just worked, but lived. It was as though the man had never fully arrived, or perhaps had been in the process of leaving. I looked over the room, my eyes moving from the desk to the window. The window, it was wide open, the curtains stirring gently in the breeze, the frame old and worn, but unbroken. The police had already done their part, taken statements, collected evidence, but there was something in the air that told me there was more. I could feel it, though I couldn't yet see it. The death had been discovered in the early hours of the morning. Webb had been found slumped over his desk, his head resting on an open manuscript, as though he had simply fallen asleep there. A heart attack, the doctor had said. No signs of foul play. The circumstances surrounding it, though, left me unsettled. A letter had been found on the desk, but no one had read it, as it had vanished before anyone had had the chance to do so. It was as though someone had intentionally erased a crucial piece of the puzzle before it could be pieced together. The one detail that caught my attention, however, was not the letter or the open window. It was the collection of papers scattered on the floor beside Webb's desk. Papers that had clearly been knocked over, though nothing appeared to be missing. There was a stack of books, some open, some closed, with notes scribbled in the margins, but they all seemed too perfect, too neatly arranged for someone who had just died unexpectedly. I spent the next hour speaking with those closest to Webb, his colleagues, his students, but their words were almost as lifeless as the man himself. No one had anything truly remarkable to say. They all spoke of his intelligence, his dedication to his work, but no one seemed to know him beyond that. His room, too, seemed to reflect the same distance. His life, it appeared, had been one of controlled detachment. It was almost as though he had been a shadow in his own world. But something was off. There was a quiet tension in the air, an unspoken understanding that something had gone wrong, something that the official story would never fully explain. A man dies of a heart attack, alone in his study, and the world moves on. But I could feel that this was more than just an accident, more than just a simple death. There was something hidden beneath the surface, something the others were not yet ready to see. I left St. Alphege that afternoon with more questions than answers. The case had barely begun, but already it felt like a riddle I would spend far too much time trying to solve. The letter, the window, the vacant study, they were pieces of a puzzle, scattered and waiting. But the answer would not come easily. Not yet. In the end, it was the silence that spoke the loudest. The quiet death of Thomas Webb, hidden behind a closed door, remained just that. A secret waiting to be uncovered. I've always found it curious, the way people reveal themselves when they believe they are not being observed. It is as if, in those moments, the mask they wear in public slips just enough for the truth to peek through. A fleeting glimpse of something real, however reluctant. It was with this thought in mind that I sat in the small, dimly lit office of St. Alphege College, staring across the polished desk at the first of the professors who might, just might, hold a key to understanding what had led to Thomas Webb's untimely death. Dr. Rosalind Trent sat across from me, her posture erect, her hands neatly folded in her lap. She was a woman whose composure seemed almost unnatural, as though she had carefully cultivated the air of detachment that surrounded her. An academic, no doubt. Her reputation as one of the brightest minds in medieval literature had preceded her. Yet, as I looked at her, I sensed a tension in her stillness. She was a woman who had long ago buried something, a truth, perhaps, or a regret, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was a regret she was still running from. I'd already heard the formalities. Dr. Trent spoke of Webb as a colleague, nothing more. And as I listened, I wondered whether the words she chose, those carefully neutral phrases, were as much for herself as for me. He was a solitary man, she had said earlier, when I'd asked her about their relationship. Dedicated to his work, but not one for socializing. I think that's why he was so well suited to Saint Alphege. She had paused then, her gaze shifting briefly to the window, as though she was searching for something in the view that was invisible to me. The moment passed quickly, and she returned to her usual measured tone. I don't see why this is relevant. His death, I mean. It's all terribly tragic, of course, but we should all be focusing on our work, shouldn't we? There was something about her, the way she spoke, the way she deflected, that didn't quite sit right with me. It was as though she was offering me a version of herself that wasn't entirely true, a version I had yet to see beyond. I leaned forward, slowly, letting the silence settle between us as I reflected on the puzzle she presented. "There's something you're not telling me, Doctor." "Trent," I said, my voice quiet but direct. "I've been to your office. I've seen your work." The words were simple enough, but I knew she would understand their weight. "Tell me, was Thomas Webb's solitary nature really that isolated? Or was there something more? A secret, perhaps, hidden in plain sight?" She blinked, just once, the briefest flutter of emotion crossing her face. And in that instant, I saw it, a crack in the calm facade she had so carefully constructed. It was gone in a flash, replaced by the same unreadable mask, but the moment had passed like a ghost in the room. I watched her, waiting as she reached for her cup of tea, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as they grasped the handle. "I don't know what you mean," she replied after a long moment, her voice cold, almost defensive. "If you are suggesting some connection between Webb's death and my own work, I think you are mistaken." I did not know him in any way beyond the professional. I had learned long ago that the key to understanding someone wasn't always in what they said, but in what they refused to say. There was more to Dr. Trent's words than she realized. The smallest things, the way she avoided my gaze when she mentioned her professional ties to Webb, the hint of bitterness in her voice when she spoke of him as solitary, told me that there was far more to her relationship with him than she was willing to admit. As I prepared to leave her office, I noticed a small detail. A book on the corner of her desk, its spine cracked from use. It was a volume of Latin poetry, one that I knew had been discussed by Webb in his earlier lectures. But this was not a book for public consumption. The markings in its margins, the underlined passages, spoke of a more personal connection to Webb's academic interests. I made a note of it, but said nothing. There were too many small things, each one playing its own quiet part in the unfolding mystery. I left Dr. Trent's office with more questions than answers. I had learned little that was concrete, but I knew she was hiding something. Something she was still desperately trying to keep buried. The faintest flicker of emotion in her eyes had told me that. But why? What was so important, so dangerous, that she would go to such lengths to conceal it? The day had begun to fade by the time I arrived at the next professor's office, that of Professor John Elston. He was a man whose reputation in medieval studies was matched only by his reputation for detachment. Where Dr. Trent had been cool, Elston was downright aloof, his eyes hidden behind thick glasses as if he were already somewhere else, somewhere far removed from the conversation. It was hard to say which of them would be the more difficult to unravel. Dr. Trent's sharp-edged composure or Elston's impenetrable distance, but I knew one thing. Neither of them would be easy to read. As I knocked on Elston's door, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of déjà vu. Another professor, another piece of the puzzle. The game had only just begun, and already the pieces felt familiar, their edges fraying in the quiet tension that surrounded them. The letter had vanished before anyone could read it. A curious thing, really, an academic death with an equally curious disappearance. It was a detail that stuck with me, even as I walked the stone halls of St. Alphege. The walls, as always, had a way of absorbing noise, as if they kept their secrets hidden just below the surface. The air in the college felt heavier than it had earlier, laden with some unseen presence that neither I nor anyone else could name. I paused in front of a portrait of the college's founding scholar, the eyes in the painting staring at me with that same knowing, detached gaze. And for a moment I thought perhaps the old man was smiling. The death of Thomas Webb was officially ruled a heart attack, an untimely event in the early hours of the morning. But I could feel that something about it wasn't quite right. His colleagues, those who had claimed to know him best, were evasive when pressed for details, as if the very question of his life had become a topic best avoided. I had spoken with Dr. Trent with Professor Elston, and each had given me their version of Webb, wrapped in polite platitudes that did little to shed light on who he truly was. Still, it was the letter that lingered. There, in the center of Webb's study, had been a desk with a letter placed upon it, but the letter was gone by the time the police arrived. No one had seen it leave. No one could account for its disappearance. It was as if someone had decided in the hours before I'd arrived that its contents were better left unread, its message buried. The fact that it had been so carefully placed, almost theatrically atop his desk, made it all the more peculiar. There were no immediate explanations, no signs of struggle, no clues to explain how a letter could vanish so completely. I stood by the window now, overlooking the college courtyard. The rain had stopped, but the cold lingered in the air. The silence in Webb's study seemed to echo back at me, though I had no idea what it was I was truly looking for. A simple letter, after all, seemed too mundane for a mystery of this nature. And yet, as I looked back across the room, the small detail began to assume a different shape in my mind, something that felt more significant the more I considered it. It was not the letter itself, but the absence of it that held the key. It was the feeling that someone, perhaps even Webb, had known that it would be gone, that its contents would remain hidden, buried beneath the surface of the case. I had already noted the small, inconspicuous things, the slight disorder of the desk, the open window, the faint scent of something floral that seemed to linger in the air despite the rain. They were the kinds of details that no one else would notice, the kinds that would mean nothing unless you were willing to pause and let the silence tell you its story. I returned to the study, the door creaking softly as I pushed it open. There was the letter's empty place on the desk, a small space marked by the absence of something that had once been there. I reached for a book, one of Webb's old, worn volumes on medieval texts, and as I turned it over in my hands, a slip of paper fell from between the pages. I knew immediately that it was not part of the book but something else entirely, a small note written in the same hand as the letter that had disappeared. It was brief, just a few lines, but they were enough. A cryptic message, barely legible but unmistakable in its intent. The truth will remain untold. It must stay locked away, like the key to a door that cannot be opened. The words, though few, filled the space of the room, echoing louder than I had expected. It was a confession of sorts, though not in any way I had anticipated. The letter, it seemed, was only part of a much larger picture, and the deeper I looked, the more I realized how little I truly understood. The note had been hidden, perhaps deliberately, but in its deliberate concealment, it revealed something far darker than the polite stories that had been told about Webb's life. As I stood in the stillness of the study, the note in my hand, I felt the weight of the unspoken truth settling upon me, as heavy as the air outside, as thick as the silence that had filled this room for far too long. Someone had known and someone had acted, not out of love or hate, but out of necessity. There was more here, much more than I had imagined, and yet I could not see it all. Not yet. The letter, like the rest of the mystery, would remain open. It would wait patiently until the moment was right to reveal its meaning. But that moment had not yet arrived, for now I could only turn the note over in my hand and wonder at the strange, inscrutable game that had already begun. There is something about the weight of history that makes it difficult to see clearly, especially when it's the kind of history that people work so hard to forget. I stood in the library of St. Alphege College, the dim light of the afternoon filtering through the high windows, casting long shadows across the rows of ancient books. The air here smelled of dust and old paper, the same smell that had lingered in the corners of my own memories I'd tried, too, to forget. But history, as I had come to realize, has a way of returning, no matter how well it is buried. I was looking for something in the library's vast archives, something that had been hidden for far too long. The death of Thomas Webb had not been a simple accident, despite what the official reports claimed. And as I sifted through the records, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something here, between these shelves, that would help me make sense of it all. The clue had been right in front of me all along, but like most things in this city, it was buried beneath layers of what people wanted to remember and, more importantly, what they wanted to forget. The librarian, a quiet man by the name of Mr. Hargrove, had offered little in the way of help, but he had led me to the archives, and I had spent the better part of the afternoon combing through documents, journals, and letters that had not seen the light of day in decades. Webb had been interested in obscure texts, medieval manuscripts that few others cared to study. But as I perused the old letters between professors, I stumbled upon a name that seemed oddly familiar: Dr. Rosalind Trent. Her name had been mentioned in a letter from over 20 years ago, a letter in which she was referred to as a former student. And in that letter there was a passing mention of a falling out, a disagreement that had never been resolved. It was a small thing, almost insignificant, but it set something in motion. I leaned back in the worn chair, the silence of the library settling around me. It was in the small details, the things people left unsaid, that the truth often resided. Dr. Trent had been at St. Alfie long before Webb, and yet it was clear that something from her past had remained unresolved, something that had been pushed into the shadows. I'd spoken with her, of course, and had seen the cool detachment in her eyes. But there was more there, something I'd only just begun to see. I knew I had to speak with her again, but this time I would approach the conversation differently. No longer would I allow her carefully chosen words to cloud my judgment. I'd seen the cracks in her composure, the way she avoided certain topics, the way her gaze shifted when I mentioned Webb. There was something more between them, something that neither of them was willing to acknowledge, but that I was beginning to understand. The past, as I had learned in my years as an investigator, is rarely as far behind us as we would like to believe. We carry it with us, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in ways that haunt us until the day we die. The history between Webb and Dr. Trent was one of those things, something that had festered beneath the surface, unnoticed by most, but not by me. I could feel it, like a pulse just beneath the skin of the case, and I knew that if I was to get to the truth, I would need to dig deeper into their shared past. I made my way to Dr. Trent's office later that evening, the shadows of the college stretching long behind me. The stone corridors were quiet, their silence broken only by the distant sound of a door creaking open somewhere in the dark. When I reached her office, I found the door slightly ajar, just enough for me to see the faint glow of a desk lamp spilling out into the hallway. She looked up as I entered, her expression as composed as ever, but I could see the flicker of something behind her eyes, something I had not noticed before. She had been expecting me, and I could feel the weight of the past between us, pressing down in the air. "I see you've been busy, Inspector," she said, her voice cool, though there was an undercurrent of something else, something I couldn't yet name. "I've been doing some reading," I replied, stepping inside. "And I've found something interesting, something about you, Doctor. Trent, something from the past." Her gaze hardened, just a fraction, but it was enough. I had hit a nerve, though she was doing her best to hide it. "I don't know what you mean," she said, though the faintest tremor in her voice gave her away. "No, I'm sure you don't," I said softly, leaning against the desk. "But you see, Doctor, Trent, history has a funny way of resurfacing, even when we try our best to bury it. The truth has a way of finding its way back to us." She said nothing, her fingers tightening around the edge of the desk, but I could see the tension in her posture. There was more here, much more, than either of us were willing to admit, and as I stood there, watching her, I realized that the missing piece of the puzzle, whatever it was hidden somewhere in this unspoken history. She had tried to bury it, tried to ignore it, but I knew now that it was not something that could be forgotten. Not in a place like Oxford. Not with people like her. The past would always come back, and when it did, it would leave no room for excuses. For the first time, I felt the weight of the case settle more heavily on my shoulders. The pieces were beginning to come together, but there were still so many gaps. It would be a long road to the truth. But I had begun to see it for what it was. A history, tangled and incomplete, waiting to be uncovered. The streets of Oxford had a way of shifting beneath my feet, their familiar contours becoming ever so slightly unfamiliar with each passing day. I'd walked these streets countless times, each corner, each shadow, a part of me. And yet there were days when the city seemed to reconfigure itself, its walls and doors concealing more than they revealed. The rain had subsided by the time I left the station, but the air still carried that heavy dampness, the scent of wet stone and the faint traces of old ink that seemed to haunt the city's oldest buildings. I had intended to go straight back to my office, but as I passed by the small bookshop on Turl Street, I felt the familiar pull of its cramped, musty interior. I had always liked the place, a haven for those who sought out the forgotten texts, the obscure volumes that rarely found their way into the wider world. It was in these small, quiet places that you could still feel the pulse of Oxford, the same pulse that ran beneath the surface of its academic life, unnoticed by the masses. Inside, the dim light of the overhead lamps illuminated rows of old books, their spines cracked with age, the dust settling like an unspoken secret. I ran my fingers along the shelves, not looking for anything in particular, just letting my mind wander, as I always did in places like this. That was when I saw it. A book tucked into the corner, its binding worn, its title faded. The cover was nondescript, and yet something about it seemed to call to me, as if it had been waiting there for years, patiently, to be found. I took the book from the shelf and opened it. It was a collection of letters written by a man whose name I'd heard before, Thomas Webb, the same name that had appeared in the files of the case I'd been mulling over for days. His letters, it seemed, had been preserved here, in this dusty shop, hidden away like some forgotten fragment of a life. But there was something more to it, something I hadn't anticipated. The first letter I read was dated several months before Webb's death, a casual note to Dr. Rosalind Trent, the same woman whose cool detachment had intrigued me during our last conversation. Webb's letter was short, a few lines discussing a book he had found in the library, but there was something in his phrasing that struck me as odd. His words were too careful, too controlled, as though he were attempting to conceal something just beneath the surface. And then, at the very end of the letter, a sentence that stopped me cold. There is no turning back now. The door will remain closed, but the truth will find its way. I closed the book, feeling the weight of the words settle heavily in my chest. The letter had not been addressed to me, but it might as well have been. Webb had known something important, something dangerous, and he had left behind these traces, these quiet hints, as if to prepare for a reckoning that had never come. I left the shop quickly, my thoughts spinning. There was something I had missed, something crucial that I had failed to see. Webb had known too much, and yet, instead of speaking out, he had locked his knowledge away in the form of letters, hidden in plain sight. I knew then that I had to speak with Dr. Trent again. As I made my way back through the rain-slicked streets, I felt a familiar pull, one that had been with me ever since I first took on this case. The sense that the answer was just beyond reach, hiding somewhere in the spaces between words, between gestures. I knew Dr. Trent held the key, but I also knew she would never give it to me willingly. She had her secrets, and I would have to pry them out, piece by careful piece, until the truth was revealed. It wasn't until I turned the corner near the college gates that I saw him, Professor Elston, standing at the edge of the courtyard, looking lost in thought. I had not expected to see him here. Not so soon. There was something about his presence that unsettled me, though I couldn't say why. He was looking down at something in his hands. A letter, perhaps, though I couldn't be sure from the distance. His fingers, delicate and precise, held it with a certain care that seemed out of place. I approached him slowly, not wanting to startle him, but before I could speak, he looked up, his eyes meeting mine with that same detachment I had come to expect from him. There was something in his gaze, though, something deeper, something that spoke of guilt, or perhaps fear. "Morse," he said, his voice flat, as if we were merely two passing strangers. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I could say the same," I replied, letting the words hang in the air between us. "What are you reading?" He hesitated, his hand instinctively closing over the letter. There it was, the small gesture that had caught my attention. It was a letter, then, but whose, and why the sudden desire to hide it? "It's nothing," he said quickly, almost too quickly before turning away, his posture stiff and unreadable. I watched him walk off, a man with a mind clearly preoccupied, his secrets tightly held. The puzzle had shifted again, and I was no closer to solving it. But there was something in his reaction, the sudden tension in his shoulders, that told me I was on the right path. I turned back toward the path leading to the college, the rain beginning to fall once more. The questions, as always, remained. But with each step, I could feel the quiet certainty that the answers were out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be found. The rain had returned, as it always did in Oxford, a steady, persistent drizzle that softened the city's edges, blurring the harsh lines of its stone and steel. The shadows grew longer in the corners of the college courtyard, their shapes stretching lazily as if the day itself was reluctant to end. I had spent the better part of the afternoon speaking with the staff at St. Alphege. More polite exchanges, more polite answers. It was beginning to feel like I was chasing a shadow, trying to corner a truth that was always just out of reach. Yet, it wasn't until I left the college grounds, my footsteps echoing softly on the wet pavement, that I was struck by a single, undeniable thought. There was something in Dr. Rosalind Trent's eyes that I had missed before. The sharpness of her intellect, the cold precision with which she had spoken, had always been her most obvious traits. But beneath that, I had sensed something else, something softer, hidden just behind the walls she had so carefully constructed. The same walls that she seemed to erect whenever her past was brought into the conversation. I had watched her closely during our last meeting, but it wasn't until I saw the subtle twitch of her fingers as she spoke about Webb's death that I understood. She was hiding something, yes, but it wasn't guilt, not exactly. It was a kind of grief, something quieter, more private. It was the grief of a woman who had been touched by a man's life, but had never fully acknowledged what he meant to her. And now that he was gone, she had no way of reconciling her feelings. I had been reflecting on this, walking through the shadowed streets, when I found myself back at the King's Arms, the familiar hum of quiet conversation drawing me in. The warmth from inside beckoned, a contrast to the cool, wet air that clung to my coat. Inside, the low murmur of voices and the soft clink of glasses filled the room, but it was the silence of my own thoughts that remained the loudest. I ordered a drink, the glass in my hand warming as I turned it slowly, watching the amber liquid shift. I had not planned to return here. There were no answers to be found in the clutter of the pub, and yet, as I sipped the whiskey, I realized it was exactly where I needed to be. Dr. Trent, like all the others I had encountered, had left something unsaid. The mystery of Webb's death was not one of open hostility, nor was it driven by academic rivalry. No, it was something quieter, more insidious, an unspoken affection that had never been allowed to take form. I sat there for a while, the whiskey settling in my chest, my thoughts quiet but steady, when I felt a presence beside me. It was subtle at first, like a shifting shadow across the room, but I knew immediately who it was. "Inspector," came the soft voice, and I looked up to see her standing there. "Doctor." Trent, her figure framed by the doorway, her expression as unreadable as ever. She had come to me, but not for the reasons I had expected. There was no interrogation, no guarded defense. Instead, she was merely present, her eyes searching mine as though waiting for something I could not yet provide. "I thought I might find you here," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm. "You've been very persistent, Inspector." It's unusual for someone to be so invested in a case like this. Webb was hardly an extraordinary man. There it was again, that subtle flicker of emotion just beneath the surface. The mask she wore had cracked, ever so slightly. She was not asking for sympathy, nor was she offering an explanation. But in her words, I detected something else. A quiet longing, the kind of longing that clung to a memory, a regret, even if it was never voiced. "I suspect," I said, my voice soft but steady, "that you know more about Webb than you've let on. Not in the way others might think, but in the way that is more personal." Her gaze faltered, just for a moment before she composed herself again. "Personal," she repeated, her voice strained with a faint note of disbelief. "Webb was simply a colleague, nothing more. I never—" She stopped herself, her lips pressing together, as if she had almost spoken something she had not meant to. I didn't press her further, not yet. The moment hung between us, fragile, as if any movement might shatter it. The grief she concealed, the affection she had never acknowledged. It was clear now. She had never allowed herself to feel what Webb had meant to her, not in the way he had wanted, not in the way he had hoped. And now, as his death had exposed the quiet places within her, she was left with nothing but the burden of unspoken words. She took a small step back, her face unreadable once more, but her eyes, those eyes, still held something I could not ignore. "You don't understand, Inspector," she said, her tone almost wistful. "Some things are better left unsaid. Some things are better left buried." As she turned to leave, I watched her retreating figure, the weight of her unspoken history hanging in the air between us. She had spoken the truth, but it was a truth that would never fully be revealed. It was, after all, the kind of truth that exists only in silence, an affection that had never been allowed to find its voice. It is always the past that finds its way back to us. That thought, so simple yet so profound, was never more apparent than in the events that transpired late that afternoon. The rain had subsided, but Oxford remained soaked and cold, the streets glistening beneath a sky that seemed to stretch on forever. As I walked along the narrow lanes, the familiar smell of wet stone and damp leaves filled the air, and for a moment it felt as though time had slowed to a crawl. The city, as it often does, seemed to have been suspended between moments, its ancient walls holding the weight of countless secrets just beneath the surface. I'd returned to St. Alphege College, the place where Thomas Webb had spent his final solitary days. There was something about the stillness of the college that had begun to unsettle me. The more I looked, the more I realized how many of its walls had been constructed to hide things, not just knowledge, but lives, choices, and consequences. It was a place that seemed to cherish its past, but only in the most selective way. There was something buried here, something I could feel pressing against the edges of the case. I had spent hours in the archives that morning, going over Webb's papers once again. There were no new revelations, no final piece of the puzzle that would explain his death. But there was one small detail that had caught my attention, something that had gone unnoticed before. It was a letter buried in the back of a journal addressed to no one in particular, but written in Webb's careful hand. The letter had no date, and its contents were vague, but there was one phrase that stood out like a beacon. "I know what you've done. The past will come back to haunt you." I had read those words several times, trying to understand their meaning, but they offered little clarity. The past, as I knew all too well, could be a cruel thing. It could linger in the shadows, waiting for the moment when it was most convenient to return, to expose its secrets. But whose past was Webb referring to? And why had he left these words behind, hidden away, where only someone with a particular interest might find them? The answer, it seemed, was tied to someone who had crossed my path earlier in the investigation. Dr. Rosalind Trent. I had not yet fully pieced together the nature of their relationship, but something told me that it was more than just academic. She had been too guarded when I spoke with her before, too careful in her answers. But now, as I stood in the dimly lit corridor of St. Alphege, I couldn't help but wonder if the history between her and Webb was not just professional, but something deeper, more tangled. I walked to her office, the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet echoing in the silence. As I approached the door, I caught a glimpse of her through the glass window. She was sitting at her desk, head lowered as though lost in thought. She did not hear me approach, and for a moment, I simply stood there, watching her. It was a strange thing to observe someone so closely, to see them unaware of your presence. There was a fragility to her posture, a tension in her shoulders that I had not noticed before. She was not the confident academic I had seen in our earlier meetings. She was something else now, vulnerable, exposed in a way that only the past could make someone feel. I knocked softly, and she looked up, her expression unreadable. She saw me, and for a moment there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a kind of resigned acceptance. She straightened her back and gestured for me to come in. "I've been expecting you, Inspector," she said, her voice cool, controlled, but there was an undertone there that I couldn't ignore. It was the kind of voice that said there was something more, something unsaid, just beneath the surface. "I hope I haven't interrupted anything," I replied, closing the door behind me. I could see the small details of her office, the piles of books, the scattered papers, the worn chair that had clearly been sat in far too many times. It was a room that belonged to someone who had spent their life in the pursuit of knowledge, and yet there was something more to it, something private that I could not yet reach. "No," she replied, "just the usual work. But I suppose you're not here for academic questions today." "No, Doctor." "Trent," I said, my voice soft, measured. "I'm here because I believe there's something more to your history with Thomas Webb than you've let on. Something the both of you have tried to bury, and something that's now come back to find you." She stiffened just slightly, but it was enough to confirm what I had suspected. The past was never far behind us, and for Dr. Trent, it was catching up to her now. I watched her carefully, waiting for her to speak, to offer an explanation, but she remained silent. The room seemed to close in around us, the air heavy with the unspoken words that hung between us. The past, I thought to myself, always returns. But whether it is ever truly understood is another matter entirely. The fog had rolled in once more, thick and silent, as though the city itself had drawn its breath and decided to wait. I had spent days, perhaps longer, circling the case from every angle, following the threads, weaving them together only to find the pattern had slipped from my grasp once again. It was an exhausting business, this constant dance between certainty and doubt. And yet, as the clock on my desk ticked relentlessly toward midnight, I felt something shift, something almost imperceptible but undeniable. The last piece had been placed, though I didn't quite know how or when. I leaned back in my chair, my fingers drumming absently on the edge of the table, and allowed my mind to return to that small detail. The letter, of course. It had been so central to everything, the thing I had kept coming back to, over and over again, as though it were a riddle I could not solve. The letter that had vanished the night Webb died. Its absence had been the puzzle, its contents the question, But the question had never been about the letter itself, not truly. It had always been about the person who had taken it, and why. And it was the answer to that question that had been staring me in the face all along. I rose from my chair, the movement slow, deliberate. The whiskey on my desk caught the dim light from the lamp, its amber glow a reminder of the many hours I'd spent in this room, waiting for the pieces to fall into place. But it wasn't the whiskey, not now, that would lead me to the truth. No, it was something more subtle, something far more elusive. The truth, I had learned, often reveals itself not through the obvious, but through the things we overlook. The slight shift in a conversation, the subtle hesitation in a voice. And there, buried in the quiet conversation I had had with Dr. Trent was the key. Her words had been carefully chosen, of course, but they had been a little too careful. She had told me, in so many words, that she had no reason to be involved with Webb's death, and yet I had seen something in her eyes, a flicker, just a moment's pause, when I had asked about the letter. It had been the same pause, the same brief hesitation that I had seen in her when we spoke of their past together. It was as though she was hiding something not just connected to the victim, but to herself. I had known from the moment I saw her that she had been concealing something, but I hadn't understood its significance until now. She had been trying to protect something or someone from the past, but it was the past that had come back to haunt her. Not just the guilt of a lost relationship, but something far darker, something that had been hidden behind her carefully constructed facade. I made my way through the familiar corridors of Saint Alphege, my steps silent on the old wood floors, each creak underfoot a reminder of the history that had been forged here, the weight of decades pressing down on the present. The college, once so vibrant with life, now seemed suspended in time, its halls echoing with a quiet melancholy. I had come to understand that death, in all its forms, had a strange way of lingering in places like this. It was as though the walls themselves held the secrets of those who had passed through, the echoes of their lives still present in the spaces between the stone. When I arrived at Dr. Trent's office, I found her sitting at her desk, just as I had left her. But this time, something had changed in the air between us. She was no longer the calm, controlled figure I had seen before. Her shoulders were tense, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of the desk, as though she were bracing herself for something she knew was coming. I could see the strain in her expression now, the walls she had built beginning to crumble, and I knew, without needing her to say a word, that the time had come. I took a slow breath, the words I'd rehearsed in my mind falling into place. "Dr. Trent, I have your letter. The one you thought had disappeared." Her eyes darted to the drawer in front of her, the one I knew she had locked when I first arrived, the one that had always been a small but significant detail. She knew, of course, that I was not here to speak of books or ancient texts. This was something far more personal, far more urgent. "You can keep it locked away if you like," I continued, "but the past doesn't stay locked. It always finds its way back." She said nothing for a long moment, her lips pressed together in a thin line. Then at last she looked up at me, her eyes dark with something I could not fully name, perhaps regret, perhaps guilt. "I did what I had to do," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I didn't want anyone to know. Not him. Not you." The truth was out now, hanging in the air between us. She had acted out of fear of a past that had returned to claim its due. Webb had known something, and in the end, it had been that knowledge that had cost him his life. But it wasn't just the past that had come back. It was the price of a secret, one that could no longer remain hidden. And now, like everything else, it was finally out in the open. The room seemed smaller now, the weight of the truth pressing down, but still, there was no satisfaction, no relief, just a quiet, lingering understanding that this was how things were, how they had always been. The past never truly goes away. It waits patiently in the corners of our minds until it is ready to reveal itself once more. The truth I had learned always settles into the air like smoke, slowly, steadily, until it's impossible to ignore. But I could feel it now, in the quiet room where I sat alone, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows over the scattered papers. The case had wound its way through every corner of Oxford, leaving behind whispers and half-truths. But it was here, in the stillness of the night, that it had finally revealed its weight. I had been to Dr. Trent's office, and I had heard the words I had been waiting for, but they had come too late. The confession, if it could be called that, was like a stone sinking into water, rippling the surface but never truly breaking it. Dr. Trent's voice had trembled, just slightly, as she spoke of her past with Webb, of the things left unsaid, the history that had been buried beneath layers of propriety and silence. She had wanted to keep it all hidden, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of shame, but it was the weight of that secret that had brought them both to this point. I looked out the window now, the pale light of the moon filtering through the thick clouds, casting a faint glow over the courtyard. It was a sight I had seen countless times before, but tonight it seemed different, as if the city itself had taken on a weight I could no longer ignore. The streets, empty and damp, held something I could not define, a sense of inevitability, as though all the events of the past had been leading to this moment, this final revelation. I had thought for a time that I understood the case, thought that I had pieced together all the fragments, that I had traced every step, understood every motive. But the truth, I now realized, was never as clear as it first seemed. Dr. Trent had not killed Webb out of rage or malice. It was a quieter thing, a necessary choice, a choice made to protect a secret too powerful to be exposed. The letter, the one that had disappeared on the night of Webb's death, had been the key. Not because of its contents, but because of what it represented, the final act of someone who had already been living in the shadow of their own past. I thought of Webb, of his quiet life, his obsession with history and texts, his disconnection from the world around him. He had lived for the past, but the past had never been kind to him. It had caught him in its web, wrapped him up in a story he could not escape. The truth had weighed heavily on him too, and in the end, it had been his undoing. It was ironic, I suppose, that a man so consumed by the past had ultimately been undone by it, unable to move forward, unable to let go of something that had never truly been his. As the night deepened, I found myself reflecting on my own life, on the quiet corners of Oxford that had always felt like home, but now seemed strangely foreign. I thought of the things I had left behind, the people I had failed to understand, the relationships I had let slip through my fingers. There was something in Dr. Trent's story, something in her grief, that resonated with my own sense of loss. She had spent years burying a part of herself, refusing to acknowledge the weight of the past. But the past always returns, in one form or another, and when it does, it carries with it a burden that cannot be ignored. I rose from the desk, my steps slow, deliberate. The air in the room felt heavier now, the weight of the truth settling around me like a cloak I could not cast off. There was no satisfaction in the revelation, no sense of triumph in having solved the case. In fact, it felt more like a loss, the kind of loss that settles in your bones and refuses to leave. I had found the truth, but I was no closer to understanding it than I had been before. I moved to the window, my fingers brushing against the cool glass. The city lay before me, dark and silent, as if holding its breath. I wondered, as I often did, what it would take to truly understand it, to see through the layers of history and time, to pierce the veil of silence that so often cloaked the truth. The answer, of course, was that I would never fully understand. None of us could. The weight of truth, like the weight of the past, was too heavy to bear alone. In the end, all I could do was accept it, as we all must. The truth would never be as neat as we wanted it to be. It would never resolve itself in the way we imagined, but it would always be there, waiting for us to recognize it, to acknowledge its presence, and to carry its weight. The city was quiet, the night still, and I took a final, measured sip of whiskey. The case was finished, at least on the surface. But the truth would linger. It always did. 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 It always